So I'm getting ready to cut out my pattern pieces. So I've got my pattern pieces, my front and back. I've got a pin cushion, a ruler, scissors for cutting fabric, and my fabric here. Now first what you have to do is determine the right and the wrong side of the fabric. So here it's really obvious that this is the wrong side and this is the right side. Now we have to fold our fabric in half with the right side on the inside. But we also have to work out where our selvage is. Now if you can see, you should have two ends on your fabric which are finished. So these are the finished ends of a roll called the selvage. So there's one, and if you look over here, here is the other one. Okay, so often they will have the fabric name printed on there, and they'll also have these little dots as well. So that's where the fabric was laid on pins as it was woven. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our two selvages and we're going to line them up with our fabric, the right side on the inside, and we fold that in half. Smooth it out, ensuring that your two selvages remain lined up and your material is nice and flat. As you can see, we've got the fold here and our two selvages here. Now another thing to point out is if your fabric has a pattern, mine does, work out which way do you want that pattern piece, that pattern showing up. Okay, so then once you work out which way you want your pattern to go, you have to make sure your pattern pieces go that way as well. So if I want my pattern to flow this way from top to bottom, I put my pattern piece going the same way. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to lay down your first pattern piece near the bottom of your folded fabric, so we're not having big gaps of scrap fabric in the middle as we cut it. And then we have to work out if the grain line, so if you remember, this line with two arrowheads is our grain line. That line has to be parallel with our selvage. If you put your pattern piece down this way, it's not parallel, it's perpendicular. So we always, when working with woven fabric, have to cut out our fabric so our grain line and our selvage is parallel. That way our fabric, once we finish our garment, sits really well and it sits how it should well. So there's no twisting in your fabric. So here is my pattern piece. Now before I pin it in place, I'm going to work out if my grain line is parallel to the selvage. And the way you do that is you use a ruler and you rule from the top to the selvage. Make a mental note of the measurement. So here is 29.8, and then you rule and measure from the bottom of the grain line to the selvage. So here is 30, you can't quite see it, 30.2 roughly. So I'm going to pop my finger on the top. I'm going to pivot my pattern piece slightly closer. So the grain line is slightly closer to the selvage. Remeasure. Pivot just a little bit more. Remeasure 29.8, 29.8. Okay, so that's all good. Now to make sure that doesn't move, I'm going to place a couple pins through all three layers in the middle. Alright, so now I know my pattern piece is in the correct position. The grain line is parallel to the selvage. and I've pinned it in place just to hold it, I can pin the rest of the pattern piece. Now when pinning, make sure it's all flat and pin your corners first. And your pin should go in, then out, and it should be parallel roughly to the edge you're going to cut and in about 1 centimetre. So I'm going to pin all my corners first, and then I can do the curves. And anything in between. So along the bottom, I'm going to put one every 10 centimetres or so roughly. Put an extra one in the crotch seam and 2 along the top, along where the waistband will sit. Now that's pinned in place, I can move on and do my next pattern piece. So making sure your pattern piece faces up the same way. So this is the front piece, has to face up the same way as the back piece. Check your grain line. Alright, so measuring the top of my grain line, I've got 17 centimetres and the bottom slightly less. So I'm just going to check that. Just going to pivot that slightly, a little bit back. Alright, so they're both the same. And again, I'm going to put a pin through all layers in the middle to hold it in place. Then I can do my corners, making sure everything's nice and flat. And then once you've done all your corners, if you've got any edges, like along the top, you can put one in between the corner pins. This pattern piece is pretty small, so we don't need as many pins as the back piece. And can you see when I pin, I push it in, and then I use my hand, my finger to push up the fabric to bunch it up, to push the pin head back out again. Okay, so I've got both pattern pieces pinned and I'm ready to cut them out. So to cut out, keep your fabric flat, and with your fabric scissors, you're going to use long cuts right against the edge of the pattern piece. Right along the edge, as close as you can get it, to cut out your fabric. So come back. Now here I'm going to twist my fabric around, just because it's easier for me to get to that curve from this side. Now when you do a curve like this, you can lift the fabric away as you cut around that curve. Just makes it a little bit easier. So there's my back piece. Now on my back we've got some notches. So here is one. Now with your notch you just snip through the middle of the triangle. Don't go past the end of the triangle, otherwise you might end up with a hole. Now in the back crutch you've got a double notch, so snip that. Now here we do have a tailor's tack, this circle. We're not actually going to use that, so don't worry about the tailor's tack. Now go ahead, cut your front piece and notch that as well. Okay, so I've got my front and back cut out, I've notched them. Any little scraps like this can go in the landfill bin, and your big piece you have left, We will need that for your waistband, so fold it up and put it in your locker. So I've removed the pattern pieces and I've got my front here, so I've got two for the left and the right because we cut it on a fold, and my back also I have two for the left and the right. So just looking at our pattern pieces, this part here is the waist, this part here is the crotch seam, along here is the hem, the inner leg and the outer leg. So to begin with, we're going to match one front and one back at the inner leg seam, which is that short edge. Now if you want, you can pin that in place, but I do prefer to just hold it together and stitch. Just saves a little bit of time, but you are more than welcome to pin this if you want. If you are to pin it, you would pin it so the pins are perpendicular to the edge you're going to stitch. So we're going to be stitching here. That way you can sew up to the pin, stop, take it out, and continue sewing, stop, take out the pin and finish. Okay, so I'm ready to stitch my inner leg seam. My machine is threaded up with a matching top thread and bobbin, and it's set to straight stitch. Now we're using 1 centimetre, so we're going to use that line as a guide. And always reverse at the start and at the finish. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get ready my other front and back, and I'm going to line them up as well. Right sides facing to stitch them together. So using the 1 as a guide again. Take up lever up the top when you finish. And there we have our 2 crotch seams, or sorry, not crotch seam, inner leg seams stitched. Now what we're going to do is we're going to overlock these edges. But when you overlock, you need to make sure that your front piece, let's have a look here, it's my front piece, I know because it's smaller, is sitting on top. That way our overlocking stitch is going to be facing up in the right direction. Okay, so I have my 2 fronts, one here and back here, and my other front here and my back here, attached at the inner leg seam. Now having a look, you can see this is the right side of the overlocking stitch. It's got the 2 what look like stitch lines, whereas the wrong side has a loopy look to it. Now that should be facing up when you have the front piece in front of you. Now what we need to do is we need to open our shorts and iron that seam allowance towards the back. As you can see, I'm tugging on this piece here to get that seam nice and open and flat. And then I do the same for the other side, but it gets ironed the other way, towards the back still. So now that I've ironed my inner leg seam facing the right side, I have my join there. Then I might just move the camera back. You can see I've got the front and the back. Now I've got this really long curve hemline to a corner here. Now this is the area that your trim is going to get attached to, Now you do that on both pieces. There's my other piece over there. So that's our next step, is attaching our trim. So to attach my trim, I've got the right side of my fabric facing up. This is the start of the hemline on the front. And then with my trim, I work out, is there a right and a wrong side to that? You can see there's a slight kind of embroidered pattern. So I'm going to put that side facing down. Now I need the edge of the trim that is going to be hidden once I've finished my hem to line up with the raw edge of my fabric. So if you're doing a pom-pom trim, your pom-poms would be sitting along this edge, because what's going to happen, it's going to get sewn and folded under. So that's why you have the edge of the trim you don't want to see lined up with the edge of your hem. Now for some people, they have a lace trim that is not inserted. So for us, we're doing an inserted trim where it sits in the hem like that. If it's a lace trim or a thin trim, you may want it to sit on top once you've hemmed the bottom of your shorts. So you hem it first, do your narrow hem that you learnt, and then you put your trim on top and it gets top stitched in place. So if that's you, you're going to do it that way. You need to hem the bottom first. But for us, we're doing an inserted trim. So our trim, once we've worked out which side we want showing, once it's finished, that side goes face down on top of the right side of our fabric, and we line it up with the one line. Again, you will need to reverse, and then you continue stitching, stopping and lining up. Stop, line up. Use your fingertips to hold it in place, keeping an eye on the one line, making sure you're stitching it in the right position. Now here you're about to go over the inner leg seam, so make sure that seam allowance is facing the right way, the way you should have ironed it, so that once it's flat, the right side of the overlocking is facing up. So you just continue stopping and readjusting, taking it slow. There's no need to rush. You want your trim to be nice and accurately attached. Oops, make sure you don't get anything caught underneath. As you can see, it's a little bit folded under there. So you should just have one layer of fabric with your trim. Now I'm getting to my curve of my hem. So we've got this curve here. So you have to manipulate your trim using your fingertips so that the edge lines up with the curved edge of the fabric. This part here is quite tricky, but just take it nice and slow when you go around that curve. You can probably hear my foot going on and off the foot pedal, so I've got more control. And all the way to the end. And reverse. Take up lever up, press the foot up, cut your threads. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlock that edge. So I'm going to overlock with my trim facing up under the machine, and then I'm ready for the next step. As you can see, I've overlocked that trim all the way to the end. So one big stitch line with the overlocker. Now I need to iron my trim so the seam allowance or the hem allowance sits underneath. So I'm going to do that by turning it and folding it out so it sits flat. So when you've got the curve, it's a little bit tricky, but just fold it under so it sits nice and flat. And then continue ironing until you get to the end. Folding it under. And ironing. There you go, I have my trim, the seam allowance and hem allowance all ironed under, and it's ready to be top stitched down. Now for my top stitching of my trim, I need to work out where do I want my top stitch to sit. I think the easiest is doing a foot's width, because that's probably the easiest part of the foot to line up with the join of the material and the trim. Other areas you could use as a guide, you could use the join between the plastic and the metal here in the presser foot if you wanted a real narrow top stitch. But for me, I'm going to do a foot's width, and I think that's probably the easiest one as well. So again, reverse, and then you're going to stitch all that way, making sure it's nice and flat. Just keeping an eye on your presser foot, making sure it's lined up with the join of your fabric and your trim. I'm using this hand here to keep the material nice and flat. So keep using that hand to keep your material nice and flat. You might need to use this hand as well to make it a little bit flatter as you go around the curve. Just carefully pivot and maneuver the material around. Don't go too fast doing this, otherwise you won't be accurate. Reverse again. And that is your trim inserted and top stitched. You can re-iron that and that will go flat. Now at the front piece you have this edge here. So this is the front. We know on the back we have the curve, and that goes all the way to the top, to the waistband. Whereas on the front it just goes along to the hem. So this raw edge now, we have to overlock that. So with it facing upwards, we're going to overlock that edge. And then you're going to repeat the whole process on the other side. So on your other piece of fabric, your other front and back.